Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 30th of July 2023. Here is the map legend on the screen. uh, Please pause the video if you want to know what the lines mean on my maps. Right, let's get to the map. We'll go to the northeast sector first of all, the Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna. However, I must say that there's not a lot of news coming out along the whole front line. I think weather has hampered any kind of large-scale movements from either side. So it's been quite a quiet day. This could be a refreshingly quick video. So no news out from Kupiansk particularly. We'll go the Kupiansk area, Liman Pershi, where it was active yesterday. We'll go to the Svatova area just west of there, where the Russians pushed the Ukrainians back by a number of kilometers over 2 to 3 days, maybe up to 6 kilometers in places, and 12 kilometers in width as a front line there. Now, the Ukrainians have had some success in stabilizing the front line and pushing the Russians back. We have a map here that this is Poulet Vallon's map, broadly based on Andrew Perpetua's map. Anyway, so that's similar to my blue lines here. So Andrew Perpetua has shown over the last couple of days the Russians being pushed back, and then Syriac Maps is sort of tagging along with that to some degree, sometimes a little bit behind on what other mappers show when the Russians are under a bit of pressure. So the Syriac maps indeed say this. Situation on the Luhansk front, despite the initial advances, the arrival of new Ukrainian forces managed to stabilize the front line. However, the Ukrainian army re-entered the small village of Tverdokilibove. Nevertheless, the Russian army didn't stop offensive operations, and troops made minimal advances south of Novohorovka, trying to enter into the Kharkiv Oblast from this side. I find this interesting because really make any gains there, but much more time is spent talking about these gains, I think, than the pushing back of the Ukrainians. So it's just little things like that. I suppose we're all like that. We all have our biases, right? But just kind of being aware of how people frame things, it kind of jumps out at me sometimes. But anyway, that is what's going on in that area. We have frontline report from Euromaidan Press says Ukrainian forces secure control over the village of Nadia in Luhansk Oblast and advance on Novohorovka, forcing Russian troops to abandon their positions. So this is, as we go in here, zoom in, we've got Novovodyane, Karmadianivka, Kovalivka up to Ryorodka, and then zooming in, we have Sahivka that was taken control of by the Russians. They still seem to be in control of that. And then Nadia was arguably liberated yesterday, according to some, others saying that the Russians abandoned it, but still Syriac Maps is way to the west of Nadia. But I think that is at least contested, possibly just under full control of the Ukrainians. I would trust Andrew Perpetua here and say that is at least in the grey zone, and that his lines are more accurate than Syriac Maps, although Syriac Maps has made some quite large adjustments around here, but they were really favourable to the Russians in that area. Right, as we come to the south, Ploschenka, Chervona, Popivka, that was around here that the CV-90, the Swedish infantry fighting vehicle that was captured, that was operating somewhere around this region. We come down to the south and we come up to Bilohorivka. There it is. When we go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, all the usual kind of things are said about this this whole area. I'm not really going to read any of that out. It's just kind of repelled attacks in a number of the different places, as according to both sides. Activity in Serebyanska forest, activity in Bilohorivka, Ukrainians attacking there, according to the Russian MOD, I believe, but no changes of territory, sort of a bit of a stalemate in that area. Somewhat, and then we come down to Bakhmut again, and amazingly, very little information coming out of Bakhmut. We really haven't seen much in the last 24 hours across the whole front line, as I've said, but it is interesting that this is the area where Ukraine has done fairly well recently, but yeah, not too much. The ISW says the following. Geolocated footage published on the 28th shows that Ukrainian forces advanced to the northwestern outskirts of Kupiansk. And actually, this is footage I showed you yesterday, or at least I referenced yesterday. I didn't show you the whole footage, but basically they're doing a medevac of wounded troops in this area and that is, if I get there are two coordinates given here. This is the second one, um, and we will zoom in. So this means that the Ukrainians are active pretty much on the front line of where Suriyat map says. And yesterday I said that that shows that I think realistically you're going to have the Russian front lines, or sorry, defensive lines further back, somewhere back here probably. And I think Andrew Perpetua's slightly more accurate here. Does show I've got gains here from Andrew Perpetua. He actually made them yesterday, and I didn't clock them yesterday. There are only slight gains around Kupiansk, so I've just given that a little asterisk. It's not necessarily gains over the last 24 hours, but this is just to give you the context here. You've got Bakhmut. You've got a lot of activity around the Avdiivka up to Zalizyansky area, past Orikovo-Vasilivka and Dubovo-Vasilivka, but I haven't heard anything about it. Nothing about other than sort of ISW, repelled attacks and so on and so forth. Nothing particularly granular. And then Klishchivka here still appears to be something of a grey zone. Claims of Ukrainians liberating it mostly, and then counterattack from the Russians, and who controls what in there is a bit of an unknown. And then Avdiivka possibly liberated by the Ukrainians, pushing the Russians to the east and towards this highway coming up into the south of Bakhmut. And then around Kupiansk, Ukrainians having some success in pushing the Russians back towards Zelenopilya and Kupiansk, and fighting on the outskirts of Kupiansk, as is evidenced by this. We'll just punch in this other coordinate, see if that gives us anything different. This is where the actual evacuation took place. The first one was a second infantry fighting vehicle. So that is, again, yeah, pretty much same place. So yeah, that is what's happening there. We'll go back to the ISW. Lots of geolocated footage they reference. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainians continued attacking Klishchivka, but that Russian defense is held. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces reduced the intensity of their attacks against Klishchivka due to bad weather in the area, and weather forecasts show limited rain near Klishchivka during the morning of the 29th. So, yeah, it could be why there is slightly less information all over, really. And then as we come at it, I mean, that's literally all I'm going to say about Bakhmut. Is I just can't find much information on pretty much anywhere today. Yeah, the lowest level of information I've had out of any of the sectors. Avdiivka, exactly the same. Not a lot of information at all. You've got, usual Avdiivka, Mariinka, Pervomaisky being mentioned, Krasnohorivka, which is here. That Krasnohorivka, there is one just to the north of Avdiivka as well, just to confuse matters. I'm going to talk about Myrna actually from the other day. I didn't correct myself the other day, so I'll mention that a little bit later. Right, we come on down past Novomikhailivka, Vladimirivka, and Vuhledar on towards the Velika Novosilka salient and the Berdyansk direction, as they say, as it sort of moves on towards Berdyansk in the south. So here we had success for the Ukrainians in liberating Staromyolska. Interestingly, Suriyat Maps is now saying that the Russians have retaken something of Staromyolska. Suriyat Map says during the last few hours, Russian army launched a counterattack and managed to recapture some of the high and low positions adjacent to Staromyolska, forcing the Ukrainian army to withdraw to the northern part of the town. I've not seen that anywhere else, but I mean, here's Weep Union, who's another mapper like myself. Make up your mind as to where his allegiances lie. But it's interesting because I wonder what sources other mappers use. I tell you what my sources are quite openly. And I used to compile my map based on loads and loads of sources and try and get a best fit. But actually, I've just given you, I'm letting you kind of do the calculations yourself to some degree. And I give you two mappers from slightly different positions. But I will also say, and I've got sources saying this part has been liberated, but it's not shown on any of the maps and so on and so forth. So rather than draw a kind of definite but possibly arbitrary line of my own. But someone like Weeb Union, who knows, I think he probably relies a lot on Syriac maps, who themselves appear to be towing the MOD party line more and more. So he says, I've got to say, after weeks of fighting over Staromilsk and Ukraine finally capturing it, I didn't expect the Russians to counterattack. It has lost its purpose once Ukraine took it. However, it seems that with the weeks of fighting, the village was reduced to rubble, true, and ruins. That with that, the Russians thought of it as an opportunity to inflict casualties on the Ukrainian station within the village. I just don't know that there's any evidence this is actually taking place. It's just looking at Syriac maps and going, this has happened. And I think that's sometimes a dangerous thing to do. This is why we see them taking the surrounding hills rather than entering the village itself. I mean, do we? I'd just like to see more evidence of those assertions. And they are, I think, just mere assertions. So maybe there are counterattacks. Maybe the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back. I just don't know that there's any other evidence outside of some of these more dubious claims. Um, on the other hand, there is quite a bit of talk about Priyutne. I say quite a bit. There's some talk about Priyutne. There's not a lot to talk about anyway. Priyutne is just here. There's this area to the north of it, this kind of salient, this bridgehead that's remaining stalwart Russian control. Well, I say that we're never 100% sure, are we? But it doesn't seem to have, you know, been threatened too much over the last few days. Well, maybe that's not quite the case. The mapping here from Global War Monitor has that looking very different. There's no big bridgehead to the east of Priyutne here, and there's Ukrainian control zone, very kind of small fields worth of grey zone, and then Russian zone to the south. But nonetheless, uh, 1 square kilometer has been liberated north of Priyutny, and that the Ukrainians are just 1 kilometer away from there. So when you look at my lines here, remember these refer to Russian defensive lines. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have pushed to there. So this is where the Russians, as according to say Andrew Perpetua, this blue line, this is where the Russians are. They are consolidated within the village of Priyutny, and the Ukrainians are going to be, consolidated somewhere back here, right? But they're going to be doing probing attacks in these directions. They might even be sort of up here, but they're not going to be stationed there. This isn't going to be necessarily consolidated control. They might be moving around here a bit. You might move the lines to somewhere like here, but there's going to be a lot of grey zone where they're just pressing, attacking, and then pulling back, and etc. etc. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are going to be 10 meters away from the Russians. But the claim is that the Ukrainians are a kilometer away from Priyutny, and that means they are that close. We had heard previously, you keep hearing, oh, they're a field away from here, a field away from there. They've been close to Priyutny previously, and probably fairly continually. Nonetheless, it's possible gains for the Ukrainians just north of Priyutny. Ukrainian channel related to the 46th Air Mobile Brigade, not the official one, but run by fighters, report that. So these are Ukrainian fighters reporting Ukraine has advanced towards Priyutny. Again, what we just heard, they are on the outskirts and are pressing the flanks of Uruzhaini. The Ukrainians reached the road between Novodonetsk and Kermechik. Okay, that's worth looking into. So we know that Uruzhaini is under a lot of pressure. Staromilsk being liberated, if it still is, means that they are pressured from the west, but there is a river to help them there. It's just that getting supplies into Uruzhaini really has to come from here alone, down there, but they are then flanked from the east and the north as well. So it's a difficult place to hold on to, and there is, as I say, lots of pressure on it. In fact, yesterday, the Russians said the situation of the Ukrainians in Staromilsk was terrible. Now the Ukrainians are preparing to move on. This is from a Russian source. So this kind of goes against what Syriac maps are saying. After the occupation of Staromilsk, the enemy did not begin to consolidate in order to organize a solid defense there, but eliminated our engineering obstacles in the direction of Uruzhaini. In other words, they weren't just sitting around consolidating. They were trying to take out obstacles in and around Uruzhaini, like minefields and whatnot, to allow them to attack it. Today, enemy aircraft have already, so these are Ukrainian aircraft, have already made about 7 attacks on the settlement. Electronic warfare is actively working to suppress our communications, and artillery preparation is underway. It is obvious that an attempt is being made to break into Uruzhani. Some time ago, having directed the main blow at Novodonetsk, that's to the east, the enemy also captured Uruzhani by exile, but did not have enough perseverance. After that, we increased our presence in the village, and in recent days, we have stopped any attempt to attack Uruzhani head-on. By capturing Staromyorsk, the enemy managed to move to the flank of Uruzhani, creating a threatening position for our defence. So that is to admit that things are tough, and it seems by implication that Staromyorsk is under control of the Ukrainians, and there's no talk about a counterattack there, at least from that source. Now, the claim here about Novodonetsk is the road between these two settlements, Novodonetsk and Kremenchik, is has been interdicted, perhaps. So this is this area where Andrew Perpetua has the Russian control pushed back behind that. This is arguably in the grey zone. So I think that would what Andrew Perpetua has with his mapping signifies what is going on there. And then finally, really, I mean, there's just not a lot else. This is going to Priutne. Russian shelling the Ukrainians in dug-in positions here. Ukrainians are slowly advancing towards a village. So let's see where the Ukrainians are dug in and see if that confirms what we know about Priutne. Yep. So that would say that indeed Andrew Perpetua map here is somewhat more accurate than Syriac maps. The Russian control line is there, but that seems odd if the Ukrainians are dug in literally just outside Priutne, as according to this source, and that's geolocated. Yeah, Russians are shelling Ukrainian dug-in positions there. And that's on video footage as well. So that is evidence. So the Ukrainians are dug in and being shelled by the Russians. That means that they are indeed very close to Uruzhani, within a kilometer. I mean, that is, if we measure that exact distance from the borders of Uruzhani, that's like 500 meters. So that is less than a kilometer away. Right, as we come out of the Velika Novosilka area sector, we come towards the west here, bypassing a number of places and to Robotna. And there's really no information at all out of Robotna. It's quite incredible. Uh, Considering that was the scene of a massive attack or fairly large attack recently, and the loss of a lot of Ukrainian equipment. I mean, here is a destroyed Bradley, Ukrainian Bradley with Brat protection kit. So that's one of the best protected Bradleys, upgraded kit, armor. So yeah, that's no longer a Bradley. That's for sure. So there will be a lot of lost Ukrainian kit in the area as they attacked down into the sort of eastern pocket by Robotna, and made their way south and also southeast in this two-pronged attack. And I mean, as this source says they didn't succeed in breaking through, but it was a kind of successful attack. They did make ground. Ukrainian army is looking east of Robotny for favorable positions for further attacks to the south. There is hardly any cover in the flat area and steppe, meadows, fields. Losses are inevitable. Actually, wasn't that source? It was this one. In the central axis northeast of Robotna, Ukrainians failed to break through, but the assault was successful. The Russian forces would have taken advantage of the weather to rotate heavily tested units. 810th Naval Infantry Brigade and 19th motorized Rifle Division, I think that would be. Now, yeah, I don't know whether the Russians will be rotating. They're not famed for their troop rotations, are they, particularly? But the weather will give both sides a chance to sort of gather themselves, lick their wounds before they go again, I imagine. Ukrainians have made some successful territory gains there, but at quite some cost. So I guess it depends how you define successful. And we shall see what continues there. And then not a lot coming out of Kupiansk, where we've heard that the Ukrainians have been making some gains to the south of the river as it comes into Kupiansk here. So yeah, not too much to be said there. If we go to the ISW, they don't say too much that I haven't already said. as you can see, there's not a lot of text on each of these sort of places. Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces captured a small forest area northeast of Robotna. So we just go back to Robotna here, northeast, small forest area. It's probably going to be this area there, which I think's been under their control for some time now, as opposed to anywhere else. Nowhere else really fits the northeast of Robotna forest area. And then that's that. There isn't too much else that there is text, but it didn't give us too much information really that's useful. So that's the end of the frontline update. There's just one more thing in the ISW that I thought was worth mentioning, and this kind of talks to the what I said in the news this morning in one of my news videos. The talk about in Mariupol, a construction crew was brought in. I don't know to build whether it's build buildings or trench lines or whatever, but they have been co-opted into the Russian military. They've been basically, I presume, forcibly conscripted in some way. Well, the ISW says a Ukrainian report indicates that Russian occupation authorities continue crypto mobilization. So crypto is kind of like clandestine, sort of under the radar mobilization efforts in occupied Ukraine to replenish losses from combat casualties. The Ukrainian Resistance Center reported that Russian occupation authorities are forcing civilians in eastern and southern Ukraine to serve in Russian military units, and that the Russian military command has staffed the 33rd Margalev detachment with Ukrainians living in occupied territories. So not only people drafted in perhaps to do work there for the Russian authorities, but also Ukrainians living in these areas. I've talked previously about how horrible it must be to be you could be a pro-Ukrainian living in any one of these occupied territories that's forced to mobilize and forced into fighting against your own side, essentially. It just must be a really horrible situation to be in. Anyway, that's the frontline update for today. If any other information comes out during the day, I will try and get it to you in some way. Anything significant, anyway, any kind of breaking news. Otherwise, I'll speak to you later in my news update, in my Ukraine War Update extra video. I'll get my words out somehow. Anyway, take care. Speak soon. Till bits.